Good evening. It's 9 p.m. on the East Coast. I'm Jaleesa Dugro, and here are the stories we're following tonight. First, new explosions cutting off roadways. Videos show an entire mountainside on fire, with secondary explosions continuing for hours, suggesting large weapon stockpiles were destroyed. New satellite imagery also is beginning to show damage at military installation sites across the region, including Prince Faisal Air Base in Jordan, one of several locations connected to U.S. partners that has now come under attack. It's become increasingly evident that the war is no longer confined to a single country, and it's expanding geographically. And then there's the Strait of Hormuz, right? New shipping data shows commercial traffic has dropped drastically. Only a handful of ships transited in the strait over the last 24 hours. This is a sign that shipping companies are growing increasingly cautious. So when we step back and analyze everything, the clear picture starts to emerge. There's no longer just the United States and Iran exchanging strikes, because the battlefield is now expanding across Iran, Iraq, Jordan, Kuwait, the Persian Gulf, and one of the most important shipping lanes on Earth. So for months, military analysts have warned about what they call an escalation trap. One side strikes, the other side responds with something a little bit bigger, and then the first side responds again, and each round becomes harder to stop than the last. It continues to grow. So tonight, it looks like we may have entered that next stage. Joining me now to discuss, I'm joined by Professor Mohammad Marandi from the University of Tehran. Professor, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Awesome. So to start us off here, I want to talk about Iran. Iran reportedly struck a desalination plant in Kuwait earlier today. So do you think that attacking the water infrastructure, which is a major escalation in this war, could be, is it concerning?
Well, I don't know exactly what was hit, but as you know, the United States has been striking critical Iranian infrastructure. It has been striking desalination plants in Iran, water reservoirs, children's hospitals, bridges, and the Iranians have warned the United States that it will retaliate. Most of these strikes, almost all of these strikes, came from Kuwait. Not all of them, but most of them. And if the Iranians have struck these facilities, it's mostly a warning signal for the Kuwaiti regime and other regimes in the Persian Gulf to stop allowing their territory to be used by the Americans to kill Iranian women.
Absolutely, and we have seen a lot of those strikes, or these Gulf states kind of being used as pawns to launch strikes on behalf of the United States military, like you said. So do you think long term that it's realistic that the United States can protect the Gulf countries moving forward for that much longer at all?
No, not at all. If the United States continues, Iran will continue to strike back. If the United States goes after Iran's critical infrastructure, Iran has warned that it will destroy all the critical infrastructure in all of these countries in the Persian Gulf. And this will be carried out in retaliation. Deterrence. Iran did not start the war. Iran did not restart the war. And Iran does not target civilians. It does not initiate escalation. But the Iranians have been very clear to the United States. If you continue down the path of targeting ordinary Iranians, we will have no alternative but to strike at those regimes that have allowed this to happen and that have facilitated this. And these regimes would collapse. These are desert regimes. They have nothing but oil and gas. And if their critical infrastructure is destroyed, people will have to leave for Iraq or Yemen, perhaps.
Right. So on that note about the United States and the continuous targeting of civilian infrastructure in Iran, we had the memorandum of understanding that seemingly almost it just collapsed between Tehran and Washington. Washington on its side here in America continues to say Iran wants to make a deal, but then they keep breaking the deal. Iran wants to make a deal, they keep breaking it. What do you think Washington's or Trump's strategy is here with this back and forth?
I don't think any sane person believes the narratives coming out of Washington anymore, especially under Trump. The United States violated every single article in the deal, every single one. They didn't even leave one where they kept their promise. They from the very beginning, they threatened the Iranian leaders and the Iranian people that it's a violation of the deal. They refrained from handing over Iran's stolen assets, another violation. They removed the sanctions on the Iranian oil exports and then reversed it within days, another violation. They were supposed to force the Israeli regime to leave Lebanon and to stop the killing. They refused to do that, another violation. They expanded the sanctions regime against Iran, another violation. And then they opened a corridor for themselves through the Strait of Hormuz, even though in Article 5, Iran is to be in charge of normalizing trade through the Strait of Hormuz. Another violation. And then, of course, they reinstated the siege and they bombed Iran, both violations. They violated everything. And so they're in no position to talk about Iran and its promises.
And now Washington is saying that it wants to charge tolls for its own vessels to go through the Strait of Hormuz and collect for reparations, moving forward. So that's interesting. I want to redirect here. There are growing concerns about the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. How likely do you think it is that shipping going through that waterway could be disrupted? What do you think that would mean or imply for the global economy?
I think we are pretty close to such a situation. The foolish provocation by the Saudis when they bombed the Sana'a International Airport, the capital of Yemen, as an Iranian civilian airliner was landing. That foolish act outraged both Iranians, but also, more importantly, the people of Yemen. This was an act of war against the people of Yemen, and the Yemeni armed forces retaliated. So tensions are very high between Saudi Arabia and Yemen. And at a time when the Strait of Hormuz is shut, if anything happens to Saudi oil installations or tankers, that would make the price of oil go through the roof. And we have to remember that in the previous war that the Saudis imposed on Yemen, what brought an end to that war was when Yemen began to strike Saudi oil assets.
So then I want to say, last question here because we're running out of time. Out of everything that's happened in the last 24 hours, we've had significant strikes, a lot of escalation, confirmed, whether it's confirmed the desalination plant being struck in Kuwait, which is pretty much existential. Most of the Gulf countries can't survive without these desalination plants. But I would also say strategic on behalf of Iran, considering the strikes that, the United States itself has sent. Where do you see the war going from now on? How much longer do you see it, taking place? What do you think would be the largest de-escalate? Is there still a path to de-escalation, actually?
It's all up to the Trump regime. Either if they stop the war, then and they implement their obligations, there's a chance for the global economy to stabilize. The more the United States continues this aggression, the closer we get to a global economic depression. If the United States expands the war, I think, and starts targeting Iran's critical infrastructure, I think that a major global economic depression, worse than the 1930s, is inevitable and imminent.
So we could be looking at a global economic depression on the horizon here if things don't stand down. All right, thank you so much for your time, Professor Marandi, and we appreciate you.
Thank you.
Now let's head over to our teams in the Middle East, where they've been covering those tit-for-tat strikes between Washington and Tehran all week. RT correspondent Saman Khajuri filed this report for us, and he continues for team coverage.
The conflict between Tehran and Washington continues to escalate, with fresh reports of overnight U.S. strikes against, multiple locations south of the country, with mounting casualties reported. Well, according to incoming reports, the death toll from the latest U.S. strikes against Bandar Khamir Bridge in Hormozgan province has risen to 7 people, with 9 others injured. Well, this comes as the latest around a few strikes against different targets. An airport in Iran, Sharon, Sistan Balochistan, has come under the U.S. attack. Also, the Bandar Abbas Railway has been struck by the U.S. military during overnight strikes against different and multiple locations south of the country. And this is considered as an instance of a war crime. This is described by Iranians as being a war crime because civilian and urban infrastructures are being now targeted by the United States during overnight attacks, and for the 6th straight nights. This comes as Iran's energy ministry has also announced that as a result of the latest round of U.S. strikes, the power lines in Bandar Abbas and surrounding areas have also been struck. And of course, according to the Iranian energy ministry, the electricity has now been restored to the affected areas. But this has also been happening, according to the health ministry, as a result of the latest round and waves of U.S. strikes against different locations. So far, at least 40 people have been killed, and more than 300 others have been injured. And in retaliation, the armed forces of the Islamic Republic of Iran have launched counter strikes and also retaliatory strikes against the U.S. military bases and assets across the region, including in Bahrain, Kuwait, and Jordan. Also, according to the latest statement released by the Iranian armed forces, Iran has launched retaliatory strikes against the U.S. military base in Syria in retaliation for latest round of U.S. strikes against Bampur garrison in Sistan Balochistan, Iran, a few days ago, which left at least 7 Iranian soldiers dead. So this is the latest retaliatory strikes by the U.S. The retaliatory strikes by the Iranian forces against different U.S. military bases and assets in the region. Of course, the IRGC also issued a strong and stern warning, saying that if the United States continues to target Iranian infrastructure, definitely the IRGC and the armed forces of the Islamic Republic of Iran will deal a fatal blow to Washington in the region. Once again, IRGC has reiterated that Strait of Hormuz remains closed because this is Iran's red line. Let's take a listen.
Should the recent threats from the President of the empty-headed United States regarding the targeting of the Islamic Republic of Iran's infrastructure by that country's aggressor army be implemented, everything that remains intact due to Iran's nobility, namely all infrastructure in the region, will be crushed by strikes of steel under no circumstances, and by no means will America, as a foreign and extra-regional country, be allowed to interfere in the Strait of Hormuz. This is Iran's unbreakable red line.
Well, the latest round of escalation between Tehran and Washington has also rattled global energy markets. Oil prices have climbed up after another night of U.S. strikes against different targets and locations south of the country, with Brent crude climbing to $85 per barrel, with the U.S. crude reaching close to $80 per barrel. Of course, the latest developments have also caused markets in Asia to react, with Japan's Nikkei 225 falling more than 3% at the open. Well, this comes as the White House has been pushing back against fears of a wider energy crisis, saying that actually the Strait of Hormuz remains open for international shipping outside the Iranian ports. And also the White House, and especially U.S. President Donald Trump, has said that well, there has been no spike in global oil prices. Let's take a listen.
The strait is open for ships that are not traveling to and from Iranian ports specifically, and the U.S. Navy is there to ensure that can take place. With respect to gas prices, as you know, the price of oil right now is approximately $80 a barrel, maybe a little less. Before I came out here, that's what it was at. Gas prices are down approximately 60 cents a gallon off the peak of this conflict, and the president was honest with the American people from the beginning. There may be temporary disruptions in the oil market, but what we haven't seen is what all of the naysayers said, that there would be massive increases in the price of oil that so many warned about.
Well, even as the White House claims that the shipping lanes are open in the Strait of Hormuz and that the global markets actually are stabilizing, well, the reality on the ground tells a different story. And this shows that the risk of further escalation remains high.
Now over to Europe, where the appointment of a new defense minister in Ukraine is raising many questions and igniting protests all across the country. RT's Roman Kosarev has more.
Evgeny Khmara is very well known to Moscow, primarily as the organizer of terrorist acts in Russia. Prior to his appointment, he was the acting chief of the SBU, that's Ukraine's state security service. He's been a career SBU officer since 2011, including holding the post of the commander of the so-called Alpha unit, whose tasks included the staging of some of the bloodiest so-called special operations in Russia. According to various reports by Russian security services, his unit left a major trace in organizing hundreds of strikes against civilians in Belgorod, Kursk, here in Donbass, where his targets included markets, maternity hospitals, bus stops, streets, and etc. Now, he's also credited with arranging the so-called spiderweb operation, that's a terrorist attack using drones from within the Russian territory against the country's strategic airfields in Murmansk, Irkutsk, Ivanovo, Ryazan, and Amur regions in June of last year. That's also been confirmed by the former SBU spokesperson Stanislav Rychinsky, who spoke about Khmara and his unit's terrorist activities in Russia that also included explosions on the Crimean Bridge. Now, following the terrorist attack in Moscow on Crocus Concert Hall, where 151 people were killed and hundreds more were wounded, a Ukrainian trace was confirmed by the FSB, pointing to the Alpha unit and its commander Khmara as organizers. So This alleged terrorist is now an acting defense minister of Ukraine following the removal of Mikhail Fedorov, who held the post for just 6 months. After Fedorov was dismissed, the decision unveiled a major internal strife within the top ranks of the Ukrainian military leadership. Now, Kyiv's army's current commander-in-chief, Alexander Syrsky, who hasn't been the favorite among Ukraine's other chiefs, including Fedorov. That strife between them has been highlighted. Now, Fedorov partly blames his exit on Syrsky, who allegedly gave him an ultimatum.
Syrsky personally is not ready to openly admit and discuss existing problems. He prefers to go to meetings in person, to plot and think that someone has ordered some kind of media campaign, instead of admitting that the problem lies in what is actually happening. As a result, this led to the fact that he issued an ultimatum. Instead of figuring out how to defeat Russia, he figured out how to split the country in which we live today, and therein lies the big problem.
Earlier, Yevgeny Khmara is considered to be one of the masterminds behind terrorist attacks in Russia, including against civilians. So for him, it's probably all or nothing, as bloody covert operations seem to be his forte and will continue due to the Kyiv regime's complete lack of success on the battlefield. Now, Ukraine's army has been seriously depleted, and reinforcements are extremely hard to come by, as ordinary Ukrainians, civilians, don't want to be mobilized, and well, they do all they can to avoid the violent forced mobilization. Now, that particular aspect seems to be just one of the reasons that Mikhail Fedorov lost his post, as according to Ukrainian parliament member Yaroslav Zhelezniak, Zelenskyy accused Fedorov of failing to mobilize people into the army.
Zelenskyy said he could not choose between Syrsky and Fyodorov, and he said that the latter had failed the enlistment office reform.
Now, speaking of the violent forced mobilization in Ukraine, well, the entire world has seen multiple reports and videos about goons in uniform who would simply snatch men off the street, public transport, and even their homes. In many cases, the men were never to be seen again, as they were instantly sent to the meat grinder at the front, or they never even made it to the battlefield after suffering serious injuries or even dying during the forced conscription. Now, let me remind you what Ukrainian forced mobilization looks like.
Люди воруют! Вы что, сука, делаете? Смотрите!
There are certainly quite a few issues that Ukrainians are not happy about, but they prefer to keep mum in order to survive. However, there are certain protests where the people seem to be sure that the police will not interfere, like, well, this one in support of Mikhail Fedorov, the now former defense minister. Multiple Ukrainian social media influencers and volunteers associated with Fedorov's so-called technocratic camp have described his dismissal as treason and called for the people to take to the streets. And come out they did, without any fear that they will be opposed by the authorities. It's certainly a huge contrast to other attempted protests, like the recent one in Lvov, where people decided to come out against violent forced mobilization. Now, Now, according to the many statements by the Kiev regime, the stories about violent force mobilization is nothing but Kremlin propaganda, and Ukrainians are happily enlisting. Well, the situation in Lvov proved yet again that the people have had enough, and they will no longer tolerate the kidnappings in broad daylight. But the people are facing the armed, uniformed goons all on their own and can hardly put up a fight against weapons and those who consider them as nothing but cannon fodder. The protesters were all later rounded up, forced to apologize and chant glory to Ukraine and the people snatchers known in Ukraine as recruitment officers.
I apologize for my deliberate wrongful actions against the territorial recruitment and social support centers yesterday evening in Lvov. I apologize for jumping on the vehicle and damaging the windshield. I admit my guilt and take full responsibility for my actions. I promise all the war veterans who are present here with us that within 1 month I will complete full training and join the armed forces of Ukraine.
So what we have here are two completely different responses to the protest by the Ukrainian authorities. In the case of Lvov, where people came out to protect their loved ones, they were met with the harshest police response possible, including public humiliation. But in the case of those who came out to protest the dismissal of former Defense Minister Mikhail Fyodorov, the pictures that we see all have this flair of civility, if you will. Well, that certainly raises questions about the origins and sponsorship of the rallies that began simultaneously in several Ukrainian regions. And you can't help but notice similarities in what's happening now and last year, when mass anti-corruption protests also began simultaneously all across Ukraine. In the summer of 2025, Zelenskyy signed a law that nullified the powers of Western-backed anti-corruption organizations called NABU and SAP. The streets back then also rebelled for the first time since the start of the special military operation. And 9 days later, Zelenskyy backed down and reversed his decision. Back then, it was presented as this needed change of course due to the pressure at home and abroad. What's happening right now also has, well, all of the same, if not identical, traits of an externally organized rally in order to keep Zelenskyy in check.
And that's America Now. I'm Jaleesa Dugro. For more stories, visit our website at rt.com and join us every night at 7, 8, 9, and 10. Thank you for watching. Have a good night. And remember, question everything.